Hello, my name is R.J. Snell. I'm the Director of Academic Programs at the Witherspoon Institute in Princeton, New Jersey, as well as the Executive Director of the Aquinas Institute for Catholic Life at Princeton. While I wish I could be with you together, enjoying Napa, I'm glad to be with you in this virtual way and offer my greetings to you. I have the incredible good fortune of being able to work with college students in a variety of settings and schools. And many of them are really wonderful people trying to lead serious lives. At the same time, many of them articulate their sense of frustration of not quite knowing how to lead a serious life. And somewhat shockingly to me, many of them will articulate almost a sense of grudge or grievance that what they take to be their cultural patrimony has not been offered to them. They haven't been taught by a thick tradition of how to live. So they see. That's how they see it. Now, how do I see this in them? How does this work out in their lives? First, we see a real paucity of moral language and moral conceptions. Christian Smith, in his book Lost in Transition, which was a study on emerging adults, reports that 34% of these young adults that he interviewed did not have a sense of the moral grounding for their claims. They weren't necessarily relativists. They had moral conclusions. They just had no idea of the source of those moral conclusions or how they could be grounded and demonstrated to be true or false. Most strikingly, he reports that many of the students, when asked about the question of moral foundations, didn't even understand the questions. As much as he and his fellow scholars would try to ask them, well, what is the source of your belief? They would respond by saying things like this: I don't understand, like the question. I don't understand what you're referring to. How do we get to the place where students in contemporary universities from families of good conscience and goodwill don't understand the question of moral foundations? Secondly, in terms borrowed from the late British philosopher Roger Scruton, our contemporary schools and universities are very good at teaching students knowledge that and knowledge how. Knowledge of facts about the world, knowledge of how to do things. But they're very much less effective at teaching students knowing what to do, how to lead life, what we might call phronesis or prudence in an earlier term. I recently was talking to a student who told me that nothing in her life, her schools, her clubs, her family, her religion, had given her pathways to know what to do in life, to know how to navigate life, not just as a successful person, but as a person who had moral agency and a plan for a life well lived. Third, and somewhat anecdotally, an exchange I had with a student some years ago has haunted me for quite some time. A very bright student, eager, willing to lead a good life. We're reading Camus together. I have great fondness for Camus. He's someone who asks these engaged existential questions in robust ways. But I could tell that she wasn't really resonating with Camus. So at the end of the reading group, I asked her, why didn't Camus engage you? Why did you find him boring? And this is how she put the answer to me. She said the following: if you've ever been to the dentist and been given laughing gas, you know that pain is occurring, but it's happening at a great distance, almost as if it's not happening to you. This is how I experience the questions that Camus is asking about leading an authentic life. And then she said this: my schools, my religious background, my parents, my therapists, and my doctors have all given me the means to not have to ask the questions, to never really have to grapple with the question, what am I to do in life? How am I to lead an authentic life? And to understand my own moral agency and engagement with that question. She wasn't a problem to herself in some ways, the way that anyone who's read Augustine understands themselves to be a problem or a mystery to themselves. She was lost in a sense, even though she knew how to succeed. Now, this is not really just about students. There are many in the contemporary West who feel that they're living lives where they don't know what to do or how to lead lives which are full and rich. I'm not complaining about kids these days. I'm perhaps becoming a curmudgeon in my middle age, but this is not what I'm doing here. It is the duty of a coherent society, a coherent family, a coherent religion, to give tradition to the young, pathways about how to lead and live a meaningful life. These students, when they articulate a sense that they've been robbed of a cultural patrimony, are pleading for the adults in their lives to give them a tradition, to give them a pathway to identity. Charles Taylor, one of the more influential and important philosophers of the last 30, 40 years, in his monumental book, Sources of the Self, talks about how many in the West don't have a sense of what he terms moral horizon. They find themselves, as it were, lost in space, not knowing which way is up, not knowing which way is down, not being able to distinguish left from right, near from far, moving forward from moving backward. To not have a moral horizon, to not have a sense of moral space, is, he puts it, to be lost in the grip of an identity crisis. Such a person literally would not know how to move forward morally. Now, as a result, tradition, if it's not on offer, the students lack the mediation of identity. Many of them lack the sense that there is a helpway, a pathway to moving forward. They feel as if they've been cast adrift by the adults in their life. Now, many, as a result, will engage in nostalgia projects, trying to live in worlds which no longer exist, because those no longer existent worlds gave a sense of what to do in life. Other students will in turn to feverish activism. They're not actually relativists. They want justice, they want decency, but their activism is feverish and not necessarily informed by sound reason. And increasingly, what we see in the young is a turn to rage, to what Plato in the Republic calls the misology of those who have lost the way of reason. Misology is the hatred of reason, having lost the ability to have a thick moral discourse, thick moral language, and the language of tradition, a hatred of reason, and in fact a rage may be left. Now, this is about more than politics. This is about the understanding, or in fact the lack of understanding, about how to lead a full and rich life where one's own moral agency and moral obligation is thought to be a challenge for one's own integrity and authenticity. Philip Rieff, the late sociologist, discussed what he took to be a monumental transition at the moment. He says it's a transition from one cultural form to another. The first cultural form is the cultural form of a metaphysics of creation. There's a God, there's providence. The world is governed, and the world is governed in a good and thick way. One attempts to live in harmony with the universe, in harmony with God, and indeed with reason itself. Rieff says we're in a new moment, though. He says the new moment, or the new culture, is one which isn't simply non-believing in the old culture, but in fact understands itself as dismantling that old culture. It's an active negation, or even acts of negation, to get rid of that old culture. So the new culture understands itself as negation, critique, deconstruction, unmasking the old ways. Rieff, in what I take to be something of a lovely phrase, calls the professors of this new way virtuosi of decreation. They are masters of taking apart. And one of the things that they take apart and must take apart is the family. Because the family is the means by which most people are trained not only in tradition, but trained in the ways of the older culture, the metaphysics of creation, I'll call it here. Now, how is that the case? We certainly know that not all families are functional, not all families are happy, not all families understand the metaphysics of creation or the metaphysics of God. But families, even when they're not especially functional, tend to provide the members of that family a story, a tradition. I was told many stories about my great-grandmother, who I never met, but my father had great affection for. And I was told that her life, which was a challenging one, she was a pioneer in the Western Canadian prairies, that her life and the sacrifices she made put obligations upon me. I was not simply my own, I was caught up into a longer story. I tell my own children about their great-great-grandmother and her life and how they owe it to her. In the same way, families work for the future. Families set money aside. Families hope for grandchildren. Families imagine not just the moment, but they imagine many moments not yet arrived. And that is something like the story of a tradition. Augusto del Noce, the great Italian philosopher, says that the family is really the way that Platonism, the sense of the metaphysics of the good, a good which is abiding, a good which is eternal, a good which bestows its light and its being upon all beneath, that the family is the way that most people are trained into that kind of Platonism. That's an interesting claim. Now, for revolutionaries or virtuosi of decreation, it makes sense that the family must be dismantled, the family must be deconstructed, because if the family is the means of providing a stable, fixed pathway of tradition, the mediation of a tradition to provide identity for its members, then the family is the struggle that has to be won, or has to be dismantled from their perspective. It's no accident that in Hebrew scriptures, when God decides to engage in a new way and to instruct a new covenant with Abraham, that we find Abraham who doesn't seem to know much about family. Remember that Abraham has left his father behind, his brother has passed away, and at least in some of the rabbinical literature, Abraham has in fact left his father's religion behind. In some Talmudic stories, he's smashed the idols of his father's workshop. And so Abraham is, in some ways, a fatherless, rootless, traditionless man. He's a wanderer. He doesn't know how to be a very good husband. Think of the times that he abandoned Sarah. And yet, God instructs Abraham into being Father Abraham. The covenant given to Abraham includes the covenant of family. Religion, of course. He enters into relationship with God. But part of that covenant that God gives to Abraham is the promise of descendants, as numerous as the stars above and as numerous as the sand on the shore. That's a story of tradition. It's a story of the metaphysics of creation and the ongoing mediation that tradition brings to provide family. Many of our young, many of whom I work with, desperate to lead meaningful and serious lives, articulate that they do not have that tradition. They do not have the mediation of a tradition of authority which gives them the pathways to their own freedom, which tells them that there are in fact normative directions that the tradition proposes without imposing or enforcing, but nonetheless offers an intelligent way to live. At this moment, when so many of the young are turning to rage, when so many of the young are turning to feverish activism or to nostalgia projects, while nonetheless asking the adults in the room to be adults, the church has much to offer. First, the church can offer herself as mother, and not just any mother, but a mother which professes the goodness of the fatherhood of God, and in fact proclaims a gospel which is about divine filiation, that we become adopted sons and daughters, that we are given a family, and that this family is part of the community or household of God himself. This is the gospel. This is the core of our reason as existing as church. Second, the church can offer a boldness about tradition, a way of knowing how to live. We can thicken up our social practices. We can reveal ways of prayer, ways of living, ways of receiving the sacraments, not just vague spirituality, but a thick tradition which says, here is a way to live. Here is a coherent way to live. We offer it to you as a free gift. Third, the church can offer a story, an account of moral agency. The church insists on freedom. Our whole story makes sense if and only if we are free and voluntary agents created in the image of God, capable of sin, capable of goodness, capable of acting to cooperate with the grace of God, and to in fact merit through our free acts. It's our responsibility to offer a story of moral agency and a long tradition of moral reflection about what leads to a good life and what leads to a life that doesn't flourish. That's a gift that the world is waiting to hear and to hear yet again. And fourth and finally, the church can offer its own defense of the family. This is not a struggle that we can afford to lose, and it's not a struggle we can afford to abandon. And nor is it simply about small or petty moralism. This is not tisk-tisking about the loss of family. This is a serious understanding that family and the tradition that it provides is the means by which the vast majority of people, even those who are raised in unhappy families, will be given a pathway to moral agency, will be given a pathway to accounts of what leads to a good life. One of my favorite philosophers, Bernard Lonergan, a Jesuit from the last century, made the statement that a culture in decline digs its grave with relentless consistency. Well, we're not a people of decline. We're not a people of the grave. We're a people of life and new life and abundant life. We propose and support a culture of life, and the culture needs it as much now as it ever has. And we have a remarkable number of gifts to offer. This is why work of the Napa Foundation, or the Napa Institute, matters so much, because it brings together people who offer the culture of life in thoughtful ways, in intelligent ways. And I'm very grateful to the Institute for inviting me to join you for a brief time, and indeed I'm grateful for all of you. Thank you so much.